So I do have, so there's quite a few different like mental health, like depression, anxiety scales that have been developed for Indigenous communities specifically. I've had a little bit of experience with this because I was involved with a bushfire recovery study after the 2019-2020 summer bushfires, and we happened to sort of just by pure luck, collect a really solid sample of Indigenous people who were affected by those bushfires in this larger national study. And unfortunately, we hadn't been expecting this, and so it included the patient health questionnaire. I think it's called the PHQ-9, which is really commonly used to assess depression. And we have struggled, even like now we've published a bit of this data, but struggled a bit because that assessment measure, it can be used, it has clinical cutoffs and norms and things for the non-Indigenous population, but it's been found to be like not particularly sensitive or adequate for specific Indigenous communities and peoples. And so I've done quite a bit of looking into the PHQ-9 and its cultural validity for Indigenous peoples. And it's a lot of the research that's been done on it, they've developed specific like basically regional specific PHQ-9s. So there was one team that assessed it for, I thought I wrote down the name here, but I don't have it, but it was in the Kimberley. They took it to community and workshopped the like linguistic and cultural properties of all the questions, and they made a number of changes to the PHQ-9 to make it more like valid and reliable for Indigenous communities in the Kimberleys. And so that included, for instance, questions that related to like suicide ideation and behaviour in the PHQ-9, splitting that into multiple different questions because self-harm in non-Indigenous populations is sort of uncritically related to being part of suicide ideation, but in Indigenous cultures, and particularly in the Indigenous cultures they were working within that area, cultural cutting is like a normal, totally non-depression related practice. And so they had to separate those things out to make it actually a valid assessment of depression. And there's the PHQ-9 has a few different like cultural variations across Australia. There's also different anxiety tests and stuff it's not like if you collected the PHQ-9, you might still know something about that community if you use just the regular one with those communities, but actually like using the clinical cutoffs and the norms and stuff isn't valid. And so, yeah, you need to, it's difficult because not all of like the PHQ-9, there are these different validated cultural changes that have been made, but that's not always the case for all the different scales that we use. So you have to be, I guess, considerate and really go through it and consider the way that you're using these to measure mental health, because mental health is different in Indigenous communities, and the symptoms of things like depression are different as well.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up the regional diversity, because of course it's not just non-Indigenous versus Indigenous. There's other intersectionalities as well. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in what you're saying. I think like many students might not have thought about this too much. So I just wanted something that came to my mind that might be helpful is thinking about how, like, if you imagine that crying is a symptom of depression, but actually men and women have different relationships to crying, and sometimes men are not, allowed to cry. So if you just say, have you cried in the last week? It could totally not match how depressed you are because you've been like suppressing that if you're coming from those gender norms. And also, I don't really know what cultural cutting is. Is that like, could you define that for the benefit of the readership or people that might not know it?
Yeah, so I mean, it can vary quite drastically. So it can be making certain marks on yourself for initiation. It can be part of like the grieving process to cut, but it's not for like like as a way. It's not like a form of self-harm, I guess, because it's more of a form of like self-care or like a sort of a cultural practice. There's also like sometimes parts of initiation can involve like other people cutting you and things like that. And so it's just, it just has a totally different cultural meaning. And it also
like scarification for cultural reasons.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not to say that Indigenous people never self-harm using cutting or things like that. Right. It's just that sort of it has more nuance in Indigenous cultures than it might have in like the general Australian population. And so that needs to be taken into account when you administer a test that covers that. And so there's some questions later on, I believe, about like specific like intelligence tests or even mental health, like depression and stuff, questionnaires that if an Indigenous person took them, because they're not designed for someone from an Indigenous background, might misdiagnose them because it misunderstands their lived experience and sort of the symptoms of depression in one culture aren't necessarily the same in another. And then another thing is that Western psychology is it's treated as the norm, but also as the objective truth, and then anything else is sort of an aberration to that truth. And so we like dismiss other knowledge systems and practices as being, well, that's not the truth, or if they use different, like they might not use, like in Indigenous communities, we have knowledge systems and we have a great deal of knowledge, for instance, about like fire, how to manage the land using fire and things like that. But because it doesn't sit within, this is outside of psychology, but because it doesn't sit within a Western knowledge framework, it's just been ignored for a long time. And the evidence that we have and the like years and years of evidence that we have that approach works is just ignored because it doesn't fit in with the like statistical Western knowledge framework, even though like there's no recognition that there are other ways of compiling evidence. And then I think, like, speaking of invisibility, psychology has been a bit of a dirty word in Indigenous populations for the last few hundred years, because psychology has been used as a tool against us, or like mental health systems have like failed us, or in psychology, the Australian Psychological Society like actually apologized to Indigenous peoples.
Yes, 2006, an important apology that can be viewed online today.
Yeah, and that, like, that apology is for multiple things, including not standing up either, like not doing anything. And so because of that, like there's a severe underrepresentation of Indigenous voices in psychology in Australia. And I think we have the Indigenous population makes up about 3.5% of the Australian population. Only about 1% of the Indigenous psychology undergraduate population, and then even lower for practicing psychologists out there. And so all of those like things is like partially because psychology hasn't been there for Indigenous peoples, and also until recently, the undergraduate curriculum, the way that we learn and practice psychology, hasn't been inclusive or accepting, or hasn't been a safe place for Indigenous peoples either. And that's only just started changing.
Something that comes to my mind that a couple of Indigenous people have remarked to me conversationally is that, you know, with some spiritual beliefs and kind of personal experiences, you know, the idea that like animals or trees talk to you, or that your ancestors talk to you, should not be seen as a sign of schizophrenia. I just wanted to put that into the recording, but I don't know if you have any comments to make about that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a very classic example. There's some cases of that there's some videos and recordings and stuff of that in Aotearoa as well, which is that, like, if a young Maori man, for instance, goes into the mental health system and says he's seeing his uncle, sort of appearing and telling him things, that he'd immediately be diagnosed with some sort of mental disorder and possibly like shipped off into an institution or something. But actually, that's a very normal part of like grieving, or about the like Maori culture and things like that. And it's the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it comes back to those assumptions about what mental illness actually is and how it impairs functioning and things like that. And like, as again, it's not that all Indigenous people are going to see spirits or things like that, but that seeing them and interacting with them isn't necessarily a sign of some sort of like deficit or something that's wrong.
The commonly used test that we use, for intelligence in school, it's the WAIS and the WISCs. They're all inappropriate for use. They haven't been normed on Indigenous population. They haven't been created with or for or by an Indigenous population.
I remember, for example, when I was learning about racial bias in the intelligence tests, they have all these analogy questions for those that haven't done an IQ test. So one might be like, cup is to saucer as plate is to whatever, and then you'd have to kind of put table or something like it's resting on top of it. But the point is, like, the whole concept of cups and saucers comes from like a particular tea drinking tradition that most of us don't actually relate to, maybe if your grandmother has cups and saucers, but how common is that in everyday life? So there's just many examples within the test. The way that they measure your intelligence is by asking you to relate to cultural objects.
And not everybody would eat at a table either.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then oftentimes the dimensions of intelligence are considered to be kind of verbal, analytic, and numeracy, depending on what test you're looking at. But that's kind of one breakdown. And it doesn't have, like, I remember Pat Dudgeon riffing in her interview about things like spatial judgments that are such a, an aspect that was neglected in the 80s when she was doing her research.
Absolutely. And an emotional IQ as well. There's no kind of measure on emotional intelligence, and and arguably some may say that's the most important.
Yeah.
And then also, I think elements of practical, maybe even like street smarts, for lack of a better words.
Yeah. And or things like being able to find your way in the terrain. So most of us in the era of Google Maps would be like, well, I don't want to consider that part of my intelligence. But that's the whole point. It's like, in your particular cultural context, because of Google Maps, you don't need to know how to find your way in the world. But actually finding your way in the world for most of human history has been really important, and people have individual differences in their ability to do that. But they're not measured in this test, or they are. That's a cultural choice that isn't recognized when people think about IQ.
Yeah, for sure. Someone I know has an extremely high IQ, but they struggle to function day to day, and can't get a sleep routine down, aren't great with body hygiene. Like, it's the functional aspects of their day that are bringing them and their well-being down a little bit.
Some of the tests that I've also seen that can be really inappropriate are around parenting and children. So as you know, hopefully readers, listeners as well, but here in Australia, there's just been this kind of decades-long practice of the state parachuting in and kind of stealing Aboriginal children for a variety of racist reasons. But I want to set that to the side and just say, like, the state is also interested in policing parenting and understanding when kids need help. But part of what happened historically is not understanding the nuclear family of the West versus the extended family of many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So a question could be like, do you know where your kids are? And people be like, no. Well, that would be very problematic from a Western perspective. But actually, when it's a small community, or when they're over at their grandma's, like, you can say, no, I don't know, but someone else I know knows, or like the context is trustworthy. So there's a lot of judgments that were made about the quality of parenting that come from a particular cultural perspective that had very profound negative impacts on families. Is that something you've seen or want to comment on?
Continue to have very profound negative impacts on families. Yeah. So the criteria that they use in child protection is inherently racist, and it is continuing to contribute. Like, our rates of removal are going up, whereas the non-Indigenous cohort seem to be remaining pretty standard. So there's a lot going into it, and I don't know the ins and outs of the assessments that they do, but they're not working. They're obviously increasing our rates of removal, and kids need to be with their parents. Like, they need to be with their community. Our bubs need to be raised in culture. We know it's such a resilient factor for us. It's so protective. Yeah. So when they're removed, they're put in like different family that they don't know, or different cultural background for the family, it's quite damaging, or it can be.
It can be damaging, really damaging. And the reality is there's data about this. So it's another example of kind of racist considerations of evidence, because we actually have data going back decades showing the problematic use of these screening techniques, but they continue to be used, and they're implemented within a kind of social system that seems to be like almost willfully blind to that evidence. Another example would be the incarceration of children. So right now in Australia, there's a campaign called Raise the Age, where they're trying to get young people under the age of 14 to not be considered within the adult justice system. And in different states, there's different ages. So it could be as low as 10. But in other places, in Scandinavia, it can be 16, for example. So actually, there is a science that tells us that children have very different decision-making and very different trajectories for intervention, and that when they're put into the criminal justice system at the age of 12 or 13, that's very bad for them. And so there's a kind of willful blindness to that. That's very frustrating. Many psychologists are involved in Raise the Age, and if you're interested in becoming involved in that here at UQ, the Triple P Parenting is an advocate for that campaign. But anyways, that's another example of where kind of screening methodologies are being, used to stream people into prison contexts. Is very frustrating to witness from the outside.
They also implement a lot of assessments, psychological assessments around violence and risk of reoffending, that are very racist. So we get locked up for longer. We don't get bail as often. And then we just become part of the generationally incarcerated, and it becomes the norm to expect to end up in prison, which can be really easy to accept when we expect it to be there anyway.
Yeah. And many here at UQ would be familiar with the Duncan study, which showed that when a Black person was pushing a white person in an experiment, they were judged as more violent than when a white person was pushing a Black person. And in the hospitals and in the context of incarceration, for the exact same offense, sometimes there's more restraint, more coercion, drugging and so on that's applied to Aboriginal people that are engaging in the same behavior. And that's another example of, very problematic clinical practice or clinical decisions that are being made. And, that's not to criticize any individual practitioner, but just to say, when you see this pattern, this is a terrible pattern.
Yeah. I did a mixed method study where I did collected small sentences from people if they had something to say about the answer they had just given. And the unconscious and sometimes overtly conscious racism that just came through in those studies was unreal. People saying that, why bother? Why bother getting professional development around 3% of the population?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, very troubling. And I've certainly heard a lot of racism from psychology colleagues. It is something that changes over time. But we shouldn't expect ourselves, if we're evidence-based psychologists, we shouldn't expect ourselves to be free from racism and sexism. That's just not something that the evidence supports, that just because you're a psychologist, you're not racist or like subject to stereotypes that you might have learned. So it is important, though, to take responsibility as a practitioner and scholar to kind of discover that within yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, recognize what our own biases are, what we're bringing to the table when we are working with clients, because that can really heavily impact the way that we conduct ourselves.
Yeah. And it's relevant to other cultural groups as well. I think like failing to recognize Indigenous psychologists as kind of central to Australia, because Indigenous people are the first Australians, is something that comes from racism and colonialism. But I also think if you are learning to question yourself and where you come from and the stereotypes, that's going to benefit you in interacting with all clients. So even just framing it as this training is only about the 3% instead of understanding it's about the 97% and the 3%, that's something you can unpack.
Yeah, definitely recognizing that a lot of the skills and that we implement during clinics is processes and relatability and communication, right?
Yeah.
I don't have many clients that I don't communicate with, but it's definitely more than 3%.
Just when my own research in the 1990s in Canada with the Inuit communities, that at the time the community I was working in was like heritage language speaking and second language English and French. When we use the normal intelligence tests that are verbally and culturally biased, the kids, of course, were coming out very poorly. Not surprising since they don't really even have the vocab. But when we use the Raven's progressive matrices, which are a series of kind of spatial puzzles, then they come out above the average for their age in Canada because they were really quite good at that. So it's really thinking about the choice of the test is part of the research. So it can't just be the default choice or part of your practice. It can't just be the default. You have to think about it critically. I really agree with that.
And then also think about why you're delivering it. Is it to track progress? Because you can do that on a 1 to 5. Is it to diagnose? Because diagnoses can be very weaponized against us in communities and systems. Did your client come in asking for a diagnosis, or is it you applying that diagnosis lens that you're looking for something, being like, solve that puzzle?